Red dust billowed into the air as the horse-drawn wagon screeched to a halt in front of the ranch gate. The door creaked open, and a tall figure stepped down. She wore a worn leather dress, and her thick black hair was partly braided, the rest matted with sweat from the long journey. Her shoulders were broad, her strong arms clearly visible under her rough shirt. She stood upright, tall enough that her shadow covered nearly half the gate. The driver lifted a wooden suitcase to the ground, then flicked the reins and rode off, leaving a cloud of red dust hanging in the air. In the distance, a few neighbors stood by their fences, staring and whispering to one another. Is she Apache? No. Look at her skin tone, half white, half native. Who did Boone bring home? Elias Boone stood frozen on the porch steps. He had imagined a small, gentle girl, but the woman before him looked like a warrior. Sana's gaze swept across the yard and stopped at him, her eyes dark, calm, and so deep that Elias felt his heart beat faster. The afternoon wind pushed the gate open with a creak. Sana gripped her suitcase tighter, neither stepping forward nor retreating. The air was thick, only the wind and the pounding of Elias's heart broke the silence. He swallowed hard, searching for a greeting, but all that came out was a soft whisper. Hello. Sana did not smile. She simply nodded. And in that moment, Elias knew his life had just changed, even if he had no idea how. Elias Boone stood still for a long moment on the porch, watching Sana's silhouette as she crossed the yard. The red dust slowly settled, leaving only the smell of horse sweat and the creaking sound of the gate hinges. He turned and walked back into the cabin, lifted the kettle of black coffee still hot on the stove, and poured himself a cup. The little cabin was so quiet that the sound of the spoon stirring in the cup echoed like a bell. It had been 8 years since Elias began living alone on this land. The ranch was just over 100 acres, dry and unforgiving. In the dry season, the ground cracked open. In the rains, it turned to mud. He kept farming, tending to his scrawny herd of cattle, trying to hold on to the land his father had left behind. Elias's parents had died from a fever during the harshest winter he could remember. The day he buried them, he stood alone in the tiny graveyard behind the house, the wind biting cold. Since then, he had become part of this land, quiet, hard-working, afraid to ever leave, for fear that all his family's efforts would be swallowed by time and dust. On winter nights, the cabin felt like it shrank in the darkness. Elias would sit alone at the table, carving little things out of wood with his knife, a horse, a windmill, even a miniature fence post. He never sold them. He just stored them away in a drawer, as proof that he still existed. When he first saw the mail-order bride advertisement in a Kansas newspaper, Elias had scoffed. But that night, when the wind slipped through the cracks in the door and blew out the stove flame, he started writing a letter. Not because he needed someone to cook for him, but because he needed a voice in that empty house. And now, that girl was outside, but she was nothing like he had imagined. Not a slender bride. Not someone who would hide behind him at the first sign of trouble. She felt like a wild wind blown in from the Apache valleys, carrying something Elias could not yet name. He stood up, set the coffee cup down, and took a deep breath. No matter how uncertain he felt, he knew he had invited her here. And now, the two of them would have to learn how to exist together on this land, or at the very least, he had to ask her inside. The cabin door creaked as Elias pushed it open. Sana had set her suitcase down right on the porch step, standing with her arms crossed like a bronze statue. In the fading afternoon light, her skin shimmered with a reddish-bronze hue, and the muscles in her arms stood out as she clenched the rope slung over her shoulder. "Come inside," Elias said curtly, avoiding her gaze. She gave a slight nod and stepped into the cabin. Her dust-covered moccasins left faint marks on the wooden floor. Elias pulled out a chair for her, then awkwardly opened a cabinet and placed a plate of leftover jerky and cornbread from lunch on the table. Sana sat with a straight back, not touching the food right away. She surveyed the room like a warrior assessing a battlefield, the neatly made wooden bed, the Winchester propped against the doorframe, the leather coat hanging from a hook. Elias felt himself under the same scrutiny, as if she was deciding whether he was someone worth staying for. Finally, Sana picked up a piece of jerky and began eating slowly. The faint crunch of her chewing echoed in the stillness of the room. Elias sat across from her, hands clenched tightly, searching for something to say but finding nothing. Outside, the wind whistled through the fence, carrying the giggles of neighborhood children still hanging around. Someone called out in a teasing voice, Boone married a woman taller than his doorway. Elias's face darkened. He pushed his chair back and moved toward the door, but Santa raised a hand to stop him. "Let them talk," she said, her voice low and firm. "I am used to it." Elias froze. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded and returned to the table. They ate in silence until darkness settled over the land. That night, Elias lay awake, listening to the sound of her footsteps across the floor, steady, like the distant beat of a drum. She was not sleeping, or maybe she did not want to. She sat on the porch, staring out into the darkened fields, and Elias realized something. She carried with her a long story, and if he wanted her to stay, he would have to find a way to hear it. By noon the next day, the sun was blazing across the prairie like it meant to burn everything down. Elias was hammering fence posts back in place near the corner of the corral when he heard shouting coming from the direction of Clancy's yard, the crankiest neighbor in the entire county. "Cattle. Your cattle are in my garden." Elias looked up. Nearly a dozen cows had broken through the old fence and stampeded into Clancy's cornfield, trampling the rows into chaos. Old Clancy was shouting at the top of his lungs, throwing his hat onto the dirt. "Boone, if you cannot control your herd, then pack up and move somewhere else." Before Elias could get a word out, Santa stepped off the porch. She squinted toward the cattle, then, without saying a thing, leapt onto a horse tied nearby. In a flash, she was riding straight toward the field. Red dust exploded into the air. The rope in her hand sliced through the sky with a loud whoosh. Santa let out a sharp cry in Apache, a sound so fierce it made the entire herd hesitate. The lead cow bellowed and charged, but she swung her horse in front of it, looped her rope around its horns, and yanked hard. The beast collapsed to its knees. The rest of the cows backed off, circling nervously. Santa drove her horse forward, pushing them out one by one. Within minutes, the entire herd had been forced back behind the fence. The whole neighborhood stood in stunned silence. Clancy picked up his hat, mouth open in disbelief. A child shouted with glee, "She did it!" Santa quickly tied the cows to a post, wiped the sweat from her brow, and dismounted. She stood tall, her breathing steady, as if the whole ordeal had not even winded her. The neighbors' expressions had shifted, not scorn now, but something closer to admiration. Elias walked toward her, about to say something, but Santa just nodded and turned back toward the cabin. He watched her go, feeling something stir in his chest, a mix of gratitude and awe. That evening, Elias quietly repaired the fence while Clancy kept silent. But when Elias glanced over, the old man gave a small nod as if to say, "Fair enough." For the first time, the neighbors no longer looked at Santa with suspicion. "I truly appreciate having you here." If this story brought back old memories, dusty afternoons, and the sound of hooves echoing in your heart, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. So each day, we can sit together once more, and I will tell you another tale from the wild, wild West. Night fell quickly over the prairie. After a long day, the cool evening breeze swept across the porch. Elias sat at the table, the oil lamp casting a dim yellow glow across the wooden floor. On the table were just a tin of black coffee and 2 metal cups. Santa stepped out from the back room, her hair loose over her shoulders, her face shadowed under the soft light. She sat down across from him, silent for a long while. Elias slid a cup toward her. "Thank you for what you did with the cattle," he said slowly, his voice hoarse from a full day of arguments with the neighbors. Santa took a sip of coffee, then set the cup down. "No need to thank me. The herd is yours. If you lost them, you would lose the whole ranch." Elias looked at her for a long moment. In the lamplight, he could see the thin scars on her arms. He asked quietly, "Where did you come from?" Santa turned her face slightly, as if weighing whether to answer. Then she took a deep breath. "My father was Apache. My mother was white. I never fully belonged anywhere. The tribe saw me as mixed blood, said I would bring misfortune. White folks called me half-breed, like it was some kind of curse." Elias said nothing. Santa went on, her voice growing lower. "I left the village when I was 16, lived off hunting, taking jobs where I could, learning to grow stronger every day so no one could ever touch me. But no matter where I went, people looked at me the same way, with either contempt or fear." The room was still. The oil lamp flickered. Elias laid his calloused hand flat on the table. His voice dropped low. "No one here is going to drive you away. This land belongs to both of us. If you want to stay." Santa looked at him. In her deep black eyes, Something flickered, not quite joy, but no longer suspicion either. She nodded once, very slightly. Outside, the insects hummed in the grass. Elias felt like the dark little cabin had somehow grown a little larger. For the first time in years, he no longer heard the wind howling across the roof like the cry of loneliness. The next morning, Elias rode into town to buy nails and wire. As he stepped into the general store, all conversation seemed to pause for a beat. Two women browsing through bolts of fabric turned and whispered, "I heard Boone brought home some half-Apache woman. Yeah, tall like a man. Looks frightening, they say." Elias felt a flush of heat crawl up his spine. He paid quickly, tied the coil of wire to his saddle, and rode back without a word. That afternoon, while he was fixing the fence at the far edge of the ranch, a group of riders approached the yard. Leading them was old Clancy, his face as craggy as ever. "Boone," he growled, "that woman is not welcome here. Folks in town do not want trouble with the tribe." Elias stood tall, brushing dust from his hands. Sana stepped out onto the porch, standing behind him, her dark eyes steady and unblinking. "She has not brought trouble to anyone," Elias replied, his voice low. Clancy snorted. "Yesterday was just luck. Do not let a few cows fool you into thinking she is one of us. One day, her people will come for her. And when they do, they will bring trouble right to our door." Elias took a step forward, his hand resting on the grip of the Winchester propped against the fence. "This is my land. Anyone who crosses that fence intending to harm her will leave in a different condition." The air turned heavy. Clancy gripped his reins tighter, his face flushing red. Finally, he turned his horse around, spat on the ground, and jerked his chin. "You have been warned. Do not come crying when it happens." The riders turned and disappeared in a cloud of red dust. Elias let out a slow breath and turned to see Sana still standing there. "If I leave, they will stop," she said softly. Elias shook his head. "No. This is your home, if you want it. I will not let them decide that for you." Sana was quiet for a long moment, then gave a small nod. For the first time, something like trust flickered in her eyes. At dawn the next morning, the sound of hooves echoed from the distance, steady and heavy, like the beat of war drums. Elias stepped out onto the porch, early sunlight bathing the ranch yard in gold. Sana was already there, her long black hair whipping in the wind. A group of Apache warriors rode into the yard, led by an older man, tall and commanding. He dismounted, standing upright, his eyes sharp as blades. "We have come to take her home," he said, his voice heavy. Sana stepped forward. There was no fear in her eyes. "Uncle," she said in her native tongue, "I am not going anywhere. I have found a place I belong." The man stared at her for a long moment. The early wind kicked up dust, and the creak of saddle leather filled the silence. Elias stood still, not reaching for his rifle, though his hands were clenched tight. He knew that if he had to protect her, he would, but he also knew this choice was not his to make. At last, the man turned to Elias. In his eyes now was not just scrutiny, but a measure of judgment. "Will you keep your word?" Elias gave a single, steady nod. "As long as she wants to stay. This is her home." The silence lingered one moment longer. Then the man nodded, reaching into his coat and pulling out a finely carved Apache charm. He handed it to Elias. "Then from this day, you are a friend to the tribe. Keep her safe." The warriors turned their horses and rode away. No threats, no gunfire, only the fading trail of red dust along the horizon. Sana exhaled deeply, as if shedding a weight she had carried for years. She turned to Elias, a rare smile curving her lips. "For the first time," she said softly, "I do not feel like I have to run anymore." Elias nodded, his gray eyes seeming brighter under the morning Sunday. He knew this was not just another morning, it was a true beginning. The sun was high by the time Elias and Sana returned to the cabin. The field still held traces of morning mist, dewdrops, shimmering along the barbed wire fence. Elias led the horse back into the stable, while Sana slowly tied up the rope, her movement steady, her face calm. By midday, a few neighbors stopped by. There were no more sneers, only hands carrying lumber and a few fresh coils of wire. Clancy showed up too, his face still as dry as old bark, but the anger was gone. "The north fence needs reinforcing," he said flatly. Elias nodded. "I know. Thank you." Clancy just grunted, but stayed long enough to help drive in a few fence posts before heading off. By late afternoon, the ranch looked different. The new fence was solid, the cattle pen more secure, and stacks of dry hay stood tall and neat. Santa walked along the fence line inspecting it, dust on her shoulders, sweat in her hair, but the fleeting smile on her face made Elias stop and watch for a while. As the sun set, they sat together on the porch steps, each with a cup of black coffee. The cattle wandered back toward the pen, their bells tinkling softly in the golden light. The breeze carried the scent of damp earth and dry straw. "Tomorrow, we will build a new pen," Elias said, eyes fixed on the horizon. Santa smiled, resting her elbow on her knee. "And I will teach you how to hunt buffalo the Apache way." Elias chuckled softly. He had never heard words that gave him such peace. The camera pulls back slowly. Their shadows stretch long across the red earth, the small cabin glowing beneath the sunset. Crickets begin to sing, and somewhere in the wind, a sound carries the quiet song of a West transformed. A place where a man and a woman had finally found a place to belong. Asterisk, asterisk. My friend, love does not come to make us soft. It comes to make us stronger. It reminds us that freedom only holds meaning when it is shared. And sometimes, the most beautiful thing in the Wild West is not the sound of gunfire but the quiet after the storm. When two hearts finally beat as one. In this land, folks learn to stand tall through the storms. True strength is not in muscle or gunpowder but in holding your ground and protecting the one you love even when the whole world turns its back. Asterisk, asterisk. And so, I have one small wish to send out to you, the cherished audience of Wild West storytelling. I hope you live a life full of joy and love. I love every one of you. Tell me what you felt about this story. Leave a comment down below. Press number 1 if you enjoyed this story. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling tales from the Wild West.